be okay. That looks just peachy. So, good morning, and I've called this talk "We Have Souls, They Don't," because it stems from a time back in the mid-1970s when I was living in Phoenix, Arizona, and was hosting a radio talk show every day. And I'd also just started to become involved with the animal protection movement. And whenever I had guests on the show who were talking about animal rights and other issues related to our fellow animals, you could be absolutely sure that people would call in and tell me that animals had no rights. That God, for example, had put them here for our benefit, that we have dominion over them, and in particular that we have souls and they don't. And if you think this was just religious people, it's not actually the case, because you also have people from the more scientific side of things saying that animals aren't conscious in the same way that we are, that it's okay to use them for our needs and indeed our entertainment as long as we do it humanely. And this set me off on a kind of personal quest to answer the question, why do so many people feel it's okay to treat our fellow animals the way we do? Why do so many people want to see them being dominated and humiliated? And what is it with this excuse that they don't have souls or consciousness or whatever you want to call it, and that we humans are superior to them? And if you're as puzzled and alarmed by this as I was at that point, then this talk is to say a little bit of what I've learned since then, and I hope it will provide you with a few insights that you may want to follow up on and discover more about for yourselves. So, the question, what lies at the core of the deep-rooted need that we have, or that most people have, to reject our own human animal nature in favor of human exceptionalism? And just to be clear first on who and what we actually are, we are, as you know, part of the great ape family. But at least for most of us, that's not what we want to be. And in fact, we call someone an ape when we want to insult them and to devalue who and what they are. And since we are all apes, what you're trying to say when you call someone an ape is that I am not the animal, it's you and your kind who are the animals. My ethnic or cultural background is uniquely different and special and higher up the whatever it is than yours is, so you're more ape-like than I am. As the French novelist and philosopher Albert Camus wrote, we humans are the only creatures who don't want to be what we are. So what is it about being an animal that we don't want to be? And what did those people who were calling into my talk show back then, why did they feel the need to persuade themselves and me that we are different from the animals? Certainly every species is unique in its own way, but our claim is to being fundamentally different. And if that's the case, then what is that difference? In what way are we unique? Lots of well-known thinkers through the ages have argued that it's because of our immortal soul, or some version of that makes us different. But one of the people who actually best captured what is in fact exceptional about us humans was the Scottish 19th century poet and essayist Alexander Smith. And he wrote, "It is our knowledge that we have to die that makes us human." And the American psychologist William James nailed it some more when he wrote that death is the worm at the core of the human experience. And then the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard wrote that if you are smart enough to know that you exist, you will necessarily experience two uniquely human emotions, awe and dread. And if that's the case, then all this talk about our immortal soul is kind of upside down. It's a defense against the fundamental knowledge and terror, then, that we have of our own mortality. And just at the time, back in Phoenix, Arizona, when I was puzzling over this, there was a book published that won Pulitzer Prize, and it brought the whole thing together for me like a kind of theory of everything to do with human nature. It's called The Denial of Death by the social anthropologist Ernest Becker, and it explores human nature and all our neuroses and psychoses and what lies at the heart of them. Becker gathered information from great thinkers and psychologists and theologians and philosophers over actually hundreds of years and kind of brought it all together. And here's what he writes. Man, he writes, and this includes woman, but that was kind of like 40 years ago still, so bear with it. Man, he writes, is a creator with a mind that soars out to speculate about atoms and infinity. This immense expansion, this dexterity, this ethereality, this self-consciousness gives to man literally the status of a small god in nature. And then he says, yet at the same time, man is a worm and food for worms. This is the paradox. He is out of nature, yet hopelessly in it. He sticks out of nature with a towering majesty, and yet he goes back into the ground a few feet in order blindly and dumbly to rot and disappear forever. So, this is the problem. We reach for the stars, but we cannot escape our creatureliness and our mortality, and this causes us great anxiety. So, what do? We simply deny our mortality. We tell ourselves that we're not really animals, and we claim superiority over them in order to prove it. Becker was by no means the first person to come up with these ideas, but he was the first to frame them in a kind of overall arching theory that includes psychology, philosophy, and theology, but other great writers have been exploring this whole understanding for hundreds, even thousands of years. And in fact, one of the earliest, and perhaps the most insightful of all, is the story that takes place in the Garden of Eden, where the Creator has formed humankind from the dust of the earth and has then breathed the spirit of life into them. But he's warned them never to eat of the tree of the knowledge of what's good and what's bad, because on the day that you do that, he says, on that day you shall surely die. Well, of course, as in any good story, you can be pretty sure that our two main characters are going to find themselves at the tree of knowledge before very long, and that's exactly what happens in the next chapter, where they are greeted by the serpent, this rather ambiguous character who tells them that they're not going to die from eating of the tree of knowledge at all. Quite the opposite, the serpent says, you shall become as gods. So, which is it? Which of these two voices is telling them the truth? Will humankind surely die, or will we become as gods? And the answer, of course, is both. And just to be clear, this story isn't suggesting for a moment that they had been immortal and then something happened and they became immortal. That's not what it is. It's a coming-of-age story. It's about becoming aware of death and becoming preoccupied with it. And it's an amazingly insightful story in terms of when it was written from a purely scientific point of view, in that we now know that the development of the human neocortex gradually gave rise to our enhanced ability to reflect on the past and anticipate the future, and with that came the preoccupation with mortality. So, our growing capacity for self-awareness is indeed both a blessing and a curse. We have a mind, as Becker wrote, that gives us the status of a small god in nature, and we're destined to go back into the ground a few feet to rot and disappear forever, just like all the other animals. Since the 1970s, when his book was published, Becker's work has inspired a whole new generation of psychologists and a new field of psychology that's called terror management theory. Terror management theory, as in how we try to cope with the lifelong anxiety that's generated by the knowledge and the terror of our inescapable mortality. And in a moment, we'll kind of come to the point and talk about how this affects our relationship to all the other animals. But first, if you're interested in this, I strongly recommend you to a book by three other psychologists, Sheldon Solomon and his colleagues Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pizinski, and it's called The Worm at the Core. It's a great read, very easy to read, no long words, and quite fascinating, and it explains step by step how our denial of death has given rise to the need to build self-esteem, to have a sense of personal significance, to be part of a culture, a civilization that has institutions and belief systems and art and technology that can support our view of human life as being uniquely significant and hopefully eternal, and not, as Sheldon puts it, just feeling like you're a lizard or a potato. And that doesn't mean that all of these things that we've created aren't great achievements in themselves. It just means that the apple of self-awareness that we've eaten has this troubling little worm at the core. Terror management theory explains that so much of what we do with our lives is driven by what we call immortality projects. Most obvious among these, here are just a few of them. There we go. Mortality projects. Most obviously, life extension as the first one. That's spending your life on something like an ultra-low calorie diet so that you might eke out a few more years of life at the end of life. Or figuring out how to get resurrected, as ancient Egyptians tried to do with their mummies, and people in Silicon Valley are trying to do today by figuring out how to upload their consciousness, whatever they think they're doing, to a computer and kind of go on forever again. Then there's leaving some vestige of yourself behind, kind of good works that will be remembered, great wealth, children who will carry our name, or something like building large hotels with your name emblazoned on them, and preferably just a few yards away from the White House. Massive immortality project. Most of all, then, our belief systems, by which we tell ourselves that, again, my soul, my consciousness, whatever, which is the real me, will live on. Now, again, nothing intrinsically wrong with doing any of these, or any belief system that you have or may want to have. But when you're doing it as a form of denial and a way to shore up a sense of lack of self-esteem, it's a problem. And particularly with belief systems, this can get kind of a little bit knotty, because let's say that you've embraced a belief system that says that the way to eternal life is by accepting Jesus as your personal savior, or whatever else. But then you look over there and there's this guy who's telling you that actually the way to immortality is by following absolutely to the letter the teachings of Muhammad or whoever else. So this calls into question your entire immortality project, and things can get quite ugly. Or as Sheldon Solomon in the book puts it, my immortality belief system is better than yours, and I'm going to kick your ass to pieces. Which is exactly where we are today. Anyway, we don't have time to go into all of this in detail. It's a major area of psychology, but the book, The Worm at the Core, takes Becker's work to the next level, and it will leave you with a lot to think about. But for us, this brings us to the central question: how does our fear of death and our need to deny our own animal nature impact our relationship with our fellow animals? So let's take a look at how that relationship has changed over thousands of years. Starting around 30,000 years ago, at the cave at Chauvet in France, it's the oldest known cave with human artwork, 30,000 years ago. And look at the animals they painted. They are alive. They have soul. They are our equals, or more. They are magical beings who fill us with awe. And now fast forward to a time 11,000 years ago in Turkey, when a group of hunter-gatherers, and this was still before the agricultural age had begun, when they built what is the earliest known temple at a place called Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe was most likely a shrine to the ancestors of the people who built it over many generations. And the chief archaeologist there, Klaus Schmidt, who just died sadly a few years ago, proposed that it was the center of a death cult, where departed members of the tribe could be laid to rest among the gods and with animals carved on the pillars to protect them. But when you look at the portrayal of those animals at Göbekli Tepe, one thing jumps right out at you. Instead of the magical paintings of Chauvet, you see these great pillars that represent humans, and you see the arms and hands, that's how we know that they're the humans. And then over on the other two pictures there, you see the animals. And what you see is that they're much smaller. They seem to exist only in relation to the humans rather than in their own right. So that's sort of the kind of change that's taken place over 20,000 years, now 11,000 years ago. Let's skip forward another 7,000 or 8,000 years to what we call ancient Egypt, which is really not very ancient when you think that the time between now and ancient Egypt is 1/10. Did I get that right? Yes, cave at Chauvet 10 times further back. And in Egypt, while the artwork is certainly beautiful, the animals you see are portrayed as kind of objects and symbols. Certainly gods and goddesses maybe, but basically projections of human concepts. And compared to the animals at Chauvet, they are frankly, by the time of these pictures, kind of quite devoid of soul. Soon after that, great thinkers are constructing all manner of elaborate systems and charts to explain where we humans stand on the ladder of existence. And new versions of this Scala Naturae, as it's called, the ladder of nature, new versions of this are still being trotted out even in scientific circles in order to place humans at the top of the ladder of evolution. Anyway, soon you had Aristotle saying that the divine intellect which distinguishes man from the animals is immortal and transcendent. And Augustine, Saint Augustine, explaining that in heaven there will be no corrupt animal body to weigh down the soul. So, all about creating a world that defies reality by telling us that unlike those animals, we're never going to die. And by the time of the so-called Enlightenment, you have René Descartes arguing that our fellow animals aren't even conscious. They're just biological machines whose screams when you vivisect them means nothing more than the sound of a squeaky wheel. And he did vivisect them. And so to today, where we like to see ourselves as much more advanced and humane, and in some ways perhaps we are. But our culture treats our fellow animals in a way that is perhaps worst of all, in that they have become simply commodities, processed through factories and laboratories by the millions and billions every year, used as spare parts and assessed purely in terms of their economic, indeed entertainment value. Or as a nice background for a wedding photo, or a selfie. What kind of relationship is this? Here's how Randy Malamud puts it, and Randy is a professor of English at Georgia State University, and this is from his book, Reading Zoos. We look, he writes, but we don't see. We gape, we gawk, we ogle, we leer, like the proverbial male gaze, patriarchal, invasive, horny. The human gaze is always scanning the menagerie to see what's in it for me, what looks good here, what can I take, what can I play with, what can I eat, what can I wear, which of these creatures will best amuse me. And he writes, zoos promote the pretense that we like animals, that we care about them, that we want to help them, but when we look at them through a cage, we are proclaiming, I am not an animal. You in the zoo, you are the animal. And we make them then into the other, the lesser, in the same way that men have done to women, and straight people have done to queer people, and wealthy people have done to poor people, and Europeans have done to the rest of the world, to create a hierarchy where we, by definition, by our definition, occupy the top rung. That's Randy Malamud in Reading Zoos. And just how miserably, despicably devoid of any sense of self-worth do you have to be if the only thing that makes you feel better is killing a magnificent, powerful animal like this in cold blood and having a photo taken to show off to your friends. And here's how Ernest Becker explained it. He wrote, "As soon as man had reached new forms of power, he turned against the animals with whom he had previously identified, and with a vengeance. And why do we do this? Because, he writes, the animals embodied what he feared most, a nameless, faceless death." Over the years, terror management theory has provided studies that show specifically how, whenever something sparks our mortality anxiety, even to a small extent, it affects our attitudes to non-human animals. And just last year, a new paper was published by Uri Lifshin, who's an assistant professor at Skidmore College in New York. And Uri's study shows that killing animals serves a psychological function in managing mortality anxiety. And what he found was that any subconscious reminder, any small subconscious reminder of one's mortality would cause the participants in the study to be more likely to support the killing of animals. Like, for example, these slightly sneaky psychologists will pretend to be carrying out a survey on the street on whether it's okay, say, to euthanize older dogs at shelters. Something kind of slightly harmless sounding, but that involves death and killing. And one day they'll do their survey standing outside a grocery store, but the next day they'll do it standing outside a funeral parlor. And that's the little mortality prompt, as they call it. And yes, it turns out that significantly more of the people who were stopped outside the funeral parlor will say that killing cats and dogs at shelters may be okay under this or that circumstance or whatever. And so that's an example of how they do the study and how they get the results that they want to check out. And before you say, well, that couldn't possibly apply to me because I care for all animals, understand that Uri checked for this too, and he writes in his paper, the effect was not moderated by gender, religious or political views, attitude toward animal rights, perceived similarity to non-human animals, pre-existing attitudes toward killing animals, or by the degree to which the killing was justified. Any one of us, when we get a little subconscious mortality prompt in our own way, it will just up, perhaps just to a very small extent, our tendency to support, not to go out and shoot them all or whatever, like some people do, but just to support it in some small way, perhaps. We're all subject to it, even just in small ways that we barely notice, and the point is that none of us are immune to this deep, basic human psychology. It's something that's just helpful to understand. So, now we've established why we don't want to think of ourselves as animals, and we've seen how this leads us to treat other animals the way we do. And if you're wondering whether there's any cure for mortality anxiety, the answer is that no one has come up with one. Just more and better ways of denying it. That's the only solution that we have to put into operation. But denial, as we all know, doesn't work. And certainly treating our fellow animals badly is not a cure for anything. Quite the opposite. It's actually a recipe for big trouble. That's because you cannot imbue your own life with value and meaning by devaluing the lives of others. It's a law of nature that as we give, so do we receive, that when we hurt others, we're ultimately hurting ourselves. And the deep irony of our situation is that we have so devalued the lives of our fellow animals in our efforts to rise above them, that we have now set in motion the early days of a mass extinction that could indeed swallow us all up too. And all over the world today, anxiety is at unprecedented levels, and so is denial. This is all beautifully summed up in words attributed to Chief Seattle just across the water from here 150 years ago. What is man without the animals? If all the animals were gone, man would die from a great loneliness of the spirit. For whatever happens to the animals soon happens to man. And that's the situation as we have it today. It's also what the ancient Greek poets and playwrights described as the human tragedy. They wrote that our struggle against the human condition is ultimately futile. It's what they called hubris. And that everything that we do to escape death simply creates more suffering for ourselves and each other and for our fellow animals. And that this understanding is the key to true wisdom. So where do we go from here? No simple way out. We've spent thousands of years proving that, and right now, in today's increasingly frantic, chaotic, anxiety-ridden world, we're still being driven by those two ancient voices in our head: you shall surely die, and you shall be as gods. And so we plunge onward, creating new immortality projects that maybe this time we can become as gods and stay as gods. The thing about it is that, as always, and whatever else is going on anywhere, it's always all about us. When, oh when, will we stop thinking about ourselves? As we drive the planet deeper into mass extinction, all we ever seem to think about is us and what matters to us. If we had an ounce of dignity left, it's time to say that it's no longer about us, our fears and our anxieties. It's about doing something to alleviate, to make up for the suffering that we've brought upon our fellow animals. In fact, I think many of us would say is that all that matters now is whatever we can do to mitigate the suffering of the other animals who have borne the brunt of our denial that we, like they, are animals. We can do it in large ways or small ways, but it is what we can do, and it is the most important thing we should be doing. A few weeks ago, at the third reading of Canadian Senate Bill S203, which would end the captivity of whales and dolphins in Canada, Senator Dan Christmas, told his colleagues, "In my Aboriginal upbringing, we were always taught that animals are our brothers and sisters. They are living beings," he said, "like us. They have their own spirits and their own families and their own language. And when I think of it that way," he said, "I see cetaceans as our equals." And Senator Christmas spoke of how, during the committee hearings about the bill, there was much testimony from humans on both sides of the question, many of them are here today. But no testimony, of course, was possible from the whales themselves. "I wish it were possible," he said, "to get the testimony of a cetacean." And he added, "If I had the opportunity to ask a beluga, I believe I would ask them, what is best for your family?" And what Dan Christmas said, I think, captures how we should be relating to all our fellow animals, asking them now, whoever they are, whatever their species, not what's good for us, but what is best for you and for your family. And whatever we perceive the answer to be, to act on that. Again, the bottom line now is that it's not about us any longer. It's about restitution. It's about making up as best we can for what we've done through our denial of who we are. And always to be asking the animals, or our fellow animals, what is best for you and for your family, and then acting upon it. And in doing that, I actually do believe that we will find in return some peace of mind, some relief from our own fears and anxieties, and a measure of redemption for our own selves, or, if you like, our own selves. Thank you.